and unfortunately he only was able to enjoy that for 2 years before his untimely death.
So your first band in '61.
Well, you know, because you asked me about the bomba and plena. So we weren't that. I wasn't for sure at the top of the bomba and plena that was coming out of Puerto Rico, but I certainly became aware of it in 1958 when I'm still with Vicentico Valdez, and an orchestra comes from Cuba called Cortijo y su Combo, and Cortijo made it with Ismael Rivera singing. And you know, see, you remember, so that becomes historical. As a matter of fact, Hilton Ruiz was the pianist for Ismael Rivera later on, okay? And they make the bomba, it's so popular, and it was so well played and so well done, no? And that's when we start to listen more, that I myself am being more aware. The reason we were really into what was coming out of Cuba, because that's what was being recorded. They were sending stock arrangements for 50 cents to $1, and some of the orchestras were recording them just the way they were receiving them. So Cuba was the island of what was happening and where it was really going. So that was the main interest, and certainly mine, how to structure that for a dance orchestra, which is something that I always wanted to do later.
So your first band in '61 was the original La Perfecta?
The original La Perfecta. I recorded a bomba in the early years. I did it with an album called, I believe, Azúcar, and the bomba in there called Bomba de Corazón, which Cortijo y su Combo, sorry, when Ismael Rivera enjoyed that bomba. They liked it very much.
Several of these recordings we're going to play before, if you get here early, they'll be in the warm-up so you can hear some of it. I love that picture of La Perfecta out there in the, is it in the park over by the Whitestone Bridge?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right in
that car, with that, what is that?
Yeah, that was a 36 Dodge, and it belonged to the bongo player, Chiqui Perez. It even had the original shades on it.
And you were clean at it. Y'all were clean. They all had uniform. Right, it was clean. And another thing about those early records, you were one of the first that I am aware of that made an effort to identify the dance style or rhythm style that went with the different tunes. They were on each tune, like, would say Wahonko, or would say Mambo, Cha-Cha,
Son
Montuno.
Right.
So early on, you were putting, you were functioning like an ethnomusicologist.
Well, I believe that it's due respect to the rhythmical patterns of those compositions. What happened eventually, by 1964, when Fani comes into the business then to simplify it eventually for everyone, they call it salsa music. And they, it's a música salsa, you know. But each of them have their proper names, you know, Guaracha, Montuno, Changui, they all have their proper names coming from Cuba. But they were all put together under the word of salsa. They asked that to Mr. Tino Puente once, and he said, salsa? I put salsa on my spaghetti, baby. So
it's food, that ain't no music.
Yeah. But the word was used constantly in the recordings of the Cuban orchestras. I used it. It was known as a ritmo caliente, ritmo con salsa. You know, tasty rhythm. You know, and the word salsa then becomes chosen to represent all of these rhythmical patterns, which is certainly a misnomer, but it was accepted worldwide, and it made it easier. And then the promotion behind it by the record company Fania really cemented it, you know, that it still exists.
But you were the king. Still are.
There was a lot of nobility in those years. You know, Tito Puente was the king of the mambo. Tito Rodriguez was the Raja of the mambo. You know, everybody had the titles.
But this idea of you identifying the rhythms, and on your, is it 2 records ago, or 2 or 3 records ago, you recorded a plena for the first time.
One called
Donde Está Mi Negra. But you made an effort in the liner notes to talk about it, that this was the first time, and you recorded a plena. And anyway, Hilton,
we used the pleneros of La 21, they came with their instruments, the pandereta. I always had a major degree of respect for the plena. Plena was known as the CNN, you know, at that time, going from one township to the other, informing one township of the other, of the news that was going on, the latest thing that was happening in the other township, what was happening politically, what was happening culturally. I mean, they informed everyone as they were coming by, and at the same time, as I heard later, that they cut the circumference of the same size drum of a conga drum, for example, but you can't run with 3 conga drums on your shoulder, because it was the authorities would be after them at certain times, but you could run with the panderetas, and then you could hide them, for example. So there was an ordinance against being able to present the plena in certain townships. They were coming after them. So it was quite an intriguing rhythmical pattern to record. So I kept that till the end. You know, I was more comfortable doing bomba, which I did a few of them within my recordings, than plena. Then eventually I did plena, and I wrote another one for the Hispanic dance troupe in New York. But then that was recorded by a group called Plena Libre in Puerto Rico, called Plena, and they recorded it for me. I utilized some jazz figures within the jazz structures within the folkloric of typical music of bomba plena.
So how did you think about integrating the piano and your piano figures into those rhythmic mindsets? I mean, to get inside it, because everybody, if you use a reference for how to play the piano in Latin, jazz, these words, salsa, you know, these words, everyone goes there to Palmieri first.
Well, I certainly have appreciated that throughout the years, but that was really the montunos that I was able to capture. In other words, for me, it was so important to be able to accompany the rhythmical players. Not only when you're going to be, what are you going to do behind, you know, once you took the part of a conjunto, the pianist had to do what the sax section would do, for example. And besides that, when the rhythm took their solo, and usually the chord progressions then come down to either, you know, the two diatonic and dominant or dominant. There's where we synchronize it, to the highest degree within the rhythm section, and we're accompanying a conga solo, a bongo solo, or a timbal solo, for example. What is the pianist going to do to be able to give them a guajeo, you know, something that's going to lock with the bass player so that percussionist would be completely comfortable with. And then from there, then a wambo, which would be the full tutti coming after, and then after that you just take off again, okay? Because that you already created that tensionary distance within the composition, accompanying that percussionist. So I made it my business to find these different guajeros, you know, that would excite, at the same time excite the percussionist that I was accompanying.
And you excited the world like that too.
Oh, thank you.
So, and how about your arrangements with the horns and the rest of the orchestra?
Then that was certainly, you know, the layers on top. Once I had my fundamental of bass and piano, well, what was I going to utilize later? And then another main teacher of mine was a gentleman called Mr. Bob Bianco. And Bob then brought me into the harmonic world of jazz. I was quite blessed meeting him. I met him through the trombone player, Mr. Barry Rogers, that was with me for many years. And with Bob, we started to work. And then at the same time, a little bit of I was able to capture from the Joseph Schilling system of music, the mathematical approach to it, and utilizing numbers to be able to get to some chordal structures faster than maybe what you may think, as far as like getting up in the morning and not having to, you write a series of numbers and then that would lead you into some chord progressions. If zero extension was C, so 2 semitones would be D, and another one would be E flat, and that idea. And the next thing I knew, I had 7 chords, and the next thing I did, what I wanted to do with those 7 chords, and open them up to dominant plus 9, or whatever I wanted to do. And little by little, that started to work, you know, quite magical for me to be able to present the arrangements, you know, making them quite exciting and making the coders exciting, not just going out, the coder. How would I make that coder? It refused to give, to give in to the law of gravity, for example, by forcing the issue and keeping upbeats at the coder, like 1, 2, 3, 4, bow, 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 and that kind of a thing became quite exciting within, the writings that I was presenting, and so then someone like a Bobby could help me tremendously with another teacher that I had that I loved him very much.
When you were saying that, I guess the first big record that went into the general audience was Son of Latin Music, and was it 76, 70?
Yeah, Son of Latin Music was 75.
75.
But in 1965, we did Azúcar.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and Azúcar was quite extraordinary because at that time, we were, you had to record it, if you remember, 2 minutes and 45 seconds or 2 minutes and 50 seconds. So you could put 12 compositions on a CD. So I started with a company called Alegre, all right, which was the humble company that started with a record shop in the Bronx. And the next thing he knew, he was on his way to becoming maybe one of the most incredible, wealthiest record owners. It didn't eventually happen to him, but he certainly had an upstart on that because he records then Johnny Pacheco, who we had been playing flute with my brother Charlie, when my brother changed to a charanga, which meant violins and flute. And Pacheco records it, sells about 100,000, at that time 45s, singles, and then we broke the record. I mean, they couldn't believe it. Everybody went berserk, that kind of thing. So I had started the orchestra, but I hadn't recorded yet. And my brother, the one that brings me in to do an audition for Mr. Al Santiago, was the owner. So I go and I record 2 albums. The next thing I know, little by little, Al Santiago has some bad problems, and he loses the company eventually, But in the interim, I'm able to sign with Tico Records, which is the subsidiary of Roulette at that time. And my first recording, my second recording is Azúcar, which Azúcar had been playing, I've been playing it constantly with a hit without being recorded yet, okay? And it was, I would say, one of the most incredible compositions that it was a form of a free-form type. It was arranged, we had it to arrange it, but the way we performed it, at any time we would be able to change it with the flexibility of within the piano solo and changing it, and an extended piano solo, for example, and it was the closer of the evening whenever we played. So when we come to record it, all right, they put, remember the manager of the Count Basie Orchestra, which was Mr. Teddy Reed, and Teddy Reed, we were fortunate to get him as the A&R man. At the time they were an A&R, they weren't known as producers, right? And I said, well, look, this is composition, this is the problem, this is not going to come in at 2:45, So he says, oh, don't worry about it, whatever it comes out, and it came up to 8:30. So what happened is that 8 minutes and 30 seconds, that changed the whole precedent of recording in the Latin field, and that was because it actually not in the jazz field, but in the Latin, was really strict, 245, 250. And Azúcar breaks right through, except for the Machito Orchestra that had done the jazz suites and that, of course. But for the dance, public, the dancing public, Azúcar becomes quite unique in its recording time, and the hit that it became, and then Symphony 6 caught a hold of it and wouldn't let it go, and that helped tremendously to be one of the biggest sellers that we had, and that it enabled the orchestra to not only come from uptown, but to go from uptown to downtown, and that's how we got into the Palladium eventually, and stood, we were already in the Palladium, excuse me, about a year, because the Palladium closed in 1966, so we had a run of about 2 to 2.5 years in the Palladium. Unfortunately, it closes in 1966, which I did, I'm the last orchestra to fulfill the engagement there.
And the groove of Azúcar was what they call Latin Boogaloo, right?
No, it was not. The Boogaloo comes in later, comes in late 60s, you know.
So what was it?
It was really more, I would have to call it was like a form of his Latin jazz, what we would call now Latin jazz. But for me, it was what we used to call, you know, instrumental mambo, okay? But with variations. It was really like a semi-jazz, you know, jam session type form in the way we had the flexibility within the composition to change one thing to the other. As soon as I changed something on the piano, Barry Rogers would pick up on it and then change the vamp and the other trombone, and then the flute player would solo on it. The reason that it became quite unique, the conjunto, was because there was the charanga time, which meant, you know, the dance was pachanga. You had violins and flute. What we had was 2 trombones and flute. So in certain competitions, we would be able to play that charanga feeling, you know, structure. And when we didn't use the flute, we would play in the conjunto style, the Cuban conjunto style. Instead of 3 or 4 trumpets, there was the 2 trombones and the timbal player now plays the bongo. There was no timbales. So it was a nice, different change within the original Perfecta orchestra.
Yeah, that was one of the innovations of La Perfecta.
Right.
One of the many. Well, we're moving in time. I could talk to you. I got 400,000 other questions, sir. But I want to see if a few people want to ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to get ready to close. So does someone, Noah?
Can you talk a little bit about the difference in approach at the piano that you take when you're playing behind a singer in a more structured environment versus playing with these guys doing a more jazz-based kind of thing?
Well, when we play behind the vocalist, for sure, you're accompanying, you know, he's singing his lyrics, you know? So you have your chordal changes there within the composition with the bass player, you know, you're doing your thing for the vocalist. And then when you get into what we call the montuno, he starts doing his ad lib. Then it's another attack on the piano. It's where another wajeo comes in. Now it's a change with the bass player again, and we accompany that singer until he finishes, and it'll go either to a piano solo, and then from a piano solo to a drum solo. Now we started to create what I call before the tension and resistance coming from the vocalist to piano into the rhythm section, and then bringing in what we call the mambo, which is be the, you know, when the orchestra comes in at full tutti to excite the most exciting part of the arrangement, really, and then back to the vocalist. All right, and then he's going back and forth with his soleos, and then from there the coda. When we're talking about what I do with the orchestra here, what we have tonight, which is the Latin jazz orchestra without the vocalist, now it's to satisfy the desire of the play desire of the jazz musician, which we have the first part of the composition. He has their chordal movements, all the different chords within the composition, and then what I usually do within my compositions of Latin jazz is bring it back to the form of instrumental mambos, which means that I never moved away from being danceable. I always remember the instrumental mambo that were done in the early orchestras, and they were very exciting and concerned that they can be danced to. So then you will hear the similar structure between the wajeo, the piano, and the montuno. We're back to montunos behind a percussionist, and then we'll either have, again, a mambo and then a coda to go out of the composition.
Thank you.
Mr. DeLeo.
Mr. Palmieri?
Yes, sir.
Jay was talking about your use of rhythms and identification of different rhythms in your music. There's one rhythm that I associate a lot with your music, which is the Mozambique.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering, and I know it's bien parecido a la comparsa, but I was wondering if that rhythm was something that you created out of the comparsa, or how did that come about?
Well, the Cuban percussion is called Pedro el Africano. And Pedro el Africano is the one that started with the Mozambique in Cuba, and it had another rhythmical structure. My Mozambique that I felt and we did certainly came from the feeling of the comparsa. So that you heard that Mama Conga in Mozambique, that's the name of the title of the CD. And it came really because of the percussionists we had at that time, Manuel Kendo using the bombo beat, and, you know, and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, bam, and doing that, I was able to create competitions, and the Mozambique became quite popular, except it became so popular that we ran into some complications later from the first Cubans that were coming into Cuba, coming from Cuba to Florida, and accused the rhythm of being a communistic rhythm, and that was unfortunately for the record company, because they certainly had a backfire to what was happening after the recording. But otherwise, it was certainly an exciting rhythmical pattern that I enjoyed to play. And eventually, different orchestras then started to record that Mozambique form that I started in '67. I think Ricardo Ray did, and after that it was okay. But we were the ones that caught the early flack of the problems that were coming out of Miami. But otherwise, if I had to do it again, I certainly do it again. So there's no problem. You know. Well, it was using the clusters, you know, using the clusters to excite, you know, and more like a rhythmical figure.